My name's Nick. I'm the audio engineer here at the building. I got my Bachelor's of Music Technology from the University of North Carolina. After I worked in recording studios, I toured for a few years full-time. Anyway, that's a little bit about me. This class is the dry class, straight up. But this is the class that's very foundational, ideas and concepts. And then after this class, we do the 102. There's a ton of 102 classes happening this month, so if you can't make it, just sign up for another one. The 102 is a lot more tactile. We go into the studio and I point at stuff and tell you how to use it. This class is more of the theory kind of class. So when I'm talking about sample rate or bit depth in Audio 102, you know what I'm talking about from this class. At the beginning, I just kind of like talking about what audio engineers are, different job applications. We get a lot of our grants here through workforce development grants. So we kind of include this kind of stuff where you can get jobs in audio. I think the first thing people think of is recording studios when they think of audio. But there's really a lot more than just that. And honestly, recording studios, if you're doing purely music, isn't totally lucrative. A lot of musicians are broke. So of course you have recording studios, you have recording engineers who record the music, you have mixing engineers who mix it, and then mastering engineers who master it at the end. But video games, when I was applying to jobs, when I was looking around for jobs before I got this one, there were a lot of video game jobs. There's all kinds of sound in video games. There's this really cool thing called Foley that's in film and video games, and Foley is really fun. Say I have an animation in a video game of a character walking. When I make that animation, there's obviously no sound to it. And so maybe I'll record myself my footsteps. And then I'll overlay that recording on the animation and suddenly it seems more alive. Fully recording artists record that kind of stuff and are constantly searching for sounds to make things seem more realistic. Then you have sound design, which is kind of akin to Foley, but Foley really specifies you're recording natural sounds. Sound design, you're usually designing a sound on a synthesizer, a sound that doesn't really occur in nature too easily. So maybe laser beam sounds in Star Wars, or swoosh or wipe sounds that you see in slideshow animations. And then there's ADR, automated dialogue replacement, which is huge in video games and film. The video games and film are very tied to each other. In film, which is interesting, on high production films, about 90% of the dialogue is redone in the recording studio. All the sound of the actors were talking on set and stuff with the boom mics and lav mics and stuff, a lot of that stuff isn't even used. Maybe you were shooting a scene outside and a giant truck drives by and completely ruins the audio. You have to go into the recording studio and redo it to make it clean, because when people are watching a high production film, they expect to be able to hear every single thing. Film, other stuff in film, when we were just talking about on-set audio with boom ops. I'm sure you guys have seen boom ops. They're those people holding the big long poles above their head with a microphone at the end. Even though those poles are light, they're not that heavy. Just holding anything above your head all day is kind of tough. Not only that, but your depth perception with boom opping has to be pretty decent. I mean, that mic is usually 10 feet away on a pole, and you're trying to aim it at specific places of the body. Post audio with film, after everything's been recording, we got all the similarities to video games, but then sometimes we have audio engineers who are just specifically trained in editing. So if you like editing, that might be a cool thing to do. Broadcast. Broadcast is huge. There's actually a lot of broadcast jobs. If you're watching a football game, NFL game. So usually you have an engineer who's mixing for inside the stadium, and then you have another engineer who's mixing for broadcast for people's televisions watching in their living room. And those are two totally different mixing styles. And then live sound. I did a lot of live sound. Usually when you see a concert, there's a person standing in the back making it loud. Hopefully it sounds good. I did a lot of that. I think that's kind of self-explanatory. System engineer. I did quite a bit of that too, and I think it's really nerdy and fun. And by the way, this isn't everything. This is just a list to get our brains thinking about other stuff. System engineering is designing a sound system or tuning a sound system. Say I'm a speaker rental company and a music festival is happening in the middle of the Ozark Mountains in a field. And so I rent my speakers to this music festival and they use it and whatever. And then the next weekend, I'm in downtown Fayetteville. You can imagine that the giant field sounds different than the concrete brick downtown Fayetteville. A system engineer can go in, even with the same PA, and tune it to make it as consistent as possible between different acoustical environments. So anyway, that's just a few stuff. That's obviously not everything, but I just wanted to make people aware that even though we have an awesome recording studio and we have these classes and stuff, you can apply these skills to other areas and not just recording studios and maybe get a job somewhere. Should be awesome. Brief recording history. Thomas Edison invented the wax cylinder. Worked the same way as vinyl. you had some kind of lathe that cut audio waveforms into a material. The material they were cutting it into was wax. Wax just kind of sounded like crap. Didn't have much high fidelity. There was like a lot of distortion and noise and wax. Wax cylinders, they kind of looked like, they were almost like a toilet paper roll that was covered in hot wax, and it would just spin with a needle and it would play music like that. But then we discovered vinyl lacquer, and the material of vinyl lacquer itself just sounded better than wax. There are lots of limitations with vinyl. For instance, vinyl, when you're cutting into the material with your lathe has a right or a left side and a right side. I guess different from you. You only had 2 tracks. You had a left track and you had a right track. And so when like Elvis recorded in the recording studio, Elvis had Elvis's band behind him, and then he sang, and it was all live. Everyone was doing everything, and the engineer in the studio was mixing straight to vinyl. So what that meant is that as the band was playing, they were printing to vinyl, and so if Elvis made a mistake, or the engineer made a mistake, or the guitar player, whatever made a mistake, that mistake you can't go back and redo because it was being cut to vinyl right there. And so everyone had to be on their A game. That's why there was a lot more studio musicians back then. Even though Elvis had a live band, he probably hired a studio band to go into the studio, so he only had to cut tracks once or twice because time is money. So then tape came along, and it was a big deal because tape gave us more tracks. Of course, like vinyl, there were first tape machines that started coming out were 2 tracks, left and right, but then the 4-track came out, and that was a big deal. Because now for one track you can dedicate drums to, you can dedicate another track to bass, you can dedicate another track to guitars, and you can dedicate the 4th track to vocals. Now the mix engineer can do a mix, and then the band comes in and they're like, I don't know, I think the drums are too quiet. You know, before when they printed the vinyl, it was like, well, too bad, like sorry. But now they have all those tracks isolated, and the mix engineer can be like, okay, I'm just gonna turn the drums up a little bit and reprint it. And now the band is happy. So multiple tracks gave engineers the opportunity to go back and fix stuff. By the 80s, we had tape machines that have 48 tracks on them. I think the most recent version of a recording program called Logic, you can make 1,000 tracks nowadays. So in the 50s, we went from 2 tracks to now 1,000 tracks, which is pretty awesome. Not only with digital can we add more tracks, basically unlimited, but in this building, for instance, we can send all of our audio over our computer network, all of it. I think throughout the building, we have over 800 inputs and outputs of audio throughout the whole building. If we were having a concert in the event center over here, I could send the audio all the way across the building to the Walker room, and people could watch and listen into it in there, and it'd be like under a millisecond, traveling across our computer network. A lot of flexibility with digital audio. We can send things where we want it digitally. We can have a basically unlimited track count. Lots of good things about digital. And our recording studio revolves around digital. We don't have a tape machine in there. So we're going to be talking about frequency, wavelength, amplitude, phase, Fletcher-Munson curve, sound pressure, decibels, levels, all kind of technical stuff. I'm kind of a nerd, so I like talking about the math behind it too. It's not intense, I promise. Just some basic equations, but I like also giving like more tactile kind of examples. What is sound? In physics, we describe it as just like a pressure wave that moves through a medium. So our medium here on Earth is air. When I'm talking, I'm creating a pressure wave out of my mouth, and this pressure wave is bumping into the molecules in the air, and it hits your ears and vibrates your eardrum, and you can hear what I'm saying. One crazy thing about sound that a lot of people don't realize is that the speed of sound changes. A lot of it, a big factor of it has to do with the density of the thing that the sound is traveling through. So in water is more dense than air. Sound actually travels faster through water than it does through air. Kind of crazy to think about. In physics, we can describe all these things in sound. We can describe sound as frequency and wavelength, which we'll talk about, amplitude, speed of sound, which is always changing, and sound is directional. I'm sure you've seen it before. If I get a speaker and aim at your face, you're going to hear it more than I am, because sound is directional. Frequency. What is frequency? For musicians out there, frequency can be associated with pitch. So if something has a low frequency, it has a lower pitch to the tone. If something has a higher frequency, it has a higher pitch. Human hearing is pretty important. This range, this 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Hertz are the unit of frequency. And that's pretty important. I mean, my cat can hear up to like 40,000 hertz. Elephants can hear down to 0 hertz. So different animals have different hearing ranges of frequency. If, say, here's the human hearing range, 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. A lot of us audio engineers, we divide these up into specific ranges so we can talk about it easier. So maybe from 20 hertz to 200 hertz, we call this like low end or like bass. Maybe from 200 hertz to 5,000 hertz, we'd call like mid-range, mids. And then from 5,000 hertz up to 20,000 hertz, we'd call like high end or treble or something. And everyone's probably familiar with this. Like everyone has this on their car stereo. You know, you can go into your equalizer settings on your car stereo and turn up the bass. Obviously there's volume, there's mixing with volume, which I think is the first thing that everyone thinks about. It's like, oh, that vocal's too quiet, I'm gonna turn it up. But we also mix with frequency. We can manipulate the frequencies of different things to make things meld together better. A lot of mixing has to do with mixing with volume first and foremost. Is the vocal too quiet? Is the guitar too loud? You know, those kind of decisions. But then we can look at frequency ranges of each instrument, and we can turn these ranges up and down and make things meld together better with frequency and not volume. Another example of frequency is feedback. Have you guys heard feedback at a concert? I'm sure you have. Feedback is an overexcited frequency that's very specific. Maybe 5,000 hertz is feeding back, and you're just like, boop. We have tools as audio engineers with an equalizer to like pull that 5,000 hertz out. And suddenly that frequency is less excited in the room and we don't get any more feedback. In Western music, we've assigned frequencies to notes. A on the piano, in the middle of the piano, A4 in the center. I know that's 440 hertz. So it's kind of arbitrary. We've kind of like arbitrarily assigned. Pythagoras actually figured out all this frequency stuff. These are kind of some like real world examples of frequency and how audio engineers use them. But let's look at some of the mathy stuff real quick. So the equation is F equals 1 over T. It's not too bad. It's a pretty easy equation. So I'm going to be drawing a lot of sine waves in this class because sine waves are easy to understand, but they don't really happen in nature too often, so just recognize that. I have a frequency tone generator on my phone, so we can hear what like one frequency sounds like. It's really annoying. It's not exciting, but it's good to know. So here's 500 hertz, for instance. It's not that exciting. 1,000 hertz. 1,000 is higher than 500, so the tone is going to go up in pitch. Here's 5K, it's going to be really annoying. Yeah, and that's kind of what feedback sounds like, right? Like when you hear feedback, that's kind of like, it's one tone that's really annoying, and audio engineers can grab that tone and pull it out. So I'm going to draw a little Cartesian plane for our sine wave.
We have our x-axis, which is equal to time, and our y-axis, which is equal to amplitude.
Yeah, and I'll talk about what amplitude is in a second, but time, you know, we all understand what time is. Draw a sine wave. And so with frequency, with this specific equation, we're just worried about how long it took for this sine wave to occur, from the start of the cycle to the end of the cycle. And I know it's a full cycle of a sine wave because it's at 0 here, it crosses the x-axis once, and then it hits 0 again. And that's how we define what a full cycle of a wave is. So we're concerned about how long it takes for this wave to happen. So let's say right here, t equals, I don't know, 1 second. So it took 1 second for that wave to happen. So if I plug in 1 for t, I get 1 over 1, and f equals 1, so that means that wave is 1 hertz. Let's just arbitrarily make t equal to 2. Now suddenly this wave takes 2 seconds to happen instead of 1 second to happen. If we plug in 2 to t, we get half a hertz. Let's go the other way. Let's say t takes half a second to happen. So now if I plug in half a second for t, I get 1 over 0.5, which is equal to 2. So 2 hertz. So what's happening is the longer the wave is, the longer in time it takes for the wave to happen, the lower the frequency. The shorter amount of time the wave takes to happen, the higher the frequency. The next thing we're going to talk about wavelength is literally how long are those waves, like in distance, in feet or meters or whatever. So with frequency, we're worried about how long it takes in time for them to occur. And then with wavelength, we are worried just the actual distance of the wave. With wavelength in physics, we always describe any kind of wavelength with this Greek symbol here called lambda. So you got lambda equals v over f. F is just what we talked about, frequency. V stands for velocity, which is speed with a direction. It's a vector. And what velocity is asking is what the speed of sound is. And like I said, the speed of sound is always changing, so it's kind of hard to really figure this out. But we do have an average speed of sound. The average speed of sound is about 1,200 feet per second. I don't like that number. For this class, I'm just going to do 1,000 feet per second to make the math easy. So we can do the same thing. If we know, let's say the frequency that we're looking at is 1,000 hertz. So if I plug in 1,000 for F, I get 1,000 over 1,000, and that equals to 1. And so that means the length of this 1,000 hertz wave is 1 foot. Let's say 500 hertz. So if I put in 500 for F, 1,000 over 500 is 2. So that means the length of a 500 hertz wave is 2 feet. I think it's very similar to what we were just talking about before. You know, the longer the wave took to occur in time, the lower the frequency. Now the longer the distance, the lower the frequency. And that kind of makes sense. You know, if something takes longer in time, it goes longer in distance. If I walk this far, that didn't take that much time. But if I walk this far, it takes a little more time. This, it's like Nick, why do we care about wavelength? I find this equation actually really, really useful. Let's say that I'm in a really crappy room, and the room that I'm in is like 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet. That's the room. And that's kind of akin to like a lot of bedrooms and houses. So if I plug in 10 feet for lambda, because I know the length, but I'm trying to solve for the frequency now, I can solve for F, and in this case, F would be 100 hertz. So that's telling me that my room has an issue at 100 hertz. So maybe my room is resonating a lot at 100 hertz, like I'm hearing a lot of that in my room, okay? So if I'm mixing in that room, and I'm like, and where does 100 hertz lie in our hearing range? Yeah, in the low bass range. If I'm mixing in my room and I'm having a 100 hertz issue, that's affecting the bass. So maybe if my room, for some reason, it's resonating at 100 hertz, I'm hearing a lot of 100 hertz. So in my song that I'm mixing in that room, I'm going to be like, I'm going to turn down 100 hertz because I hear a lot of it. And then I take that and I take it into my car, and now suddenly it sounds like crap. Maybe it sounds like there's no bass in my car because I removed it all in my room because my room was influencing the way that I was hearing it. Every environment changes the sound. So like that's one good thing about our recording studio is we were able to build it from the ground up. We were able to get an acoustic consultant in. Yeah, you can measure your room and you can use this equation and just like do some napkin math and figure out maybe what problematic frequencies are in your room. It's really hard to fix them. You can get acoustic treatment that will make it better. It won't make it perfect, but at least you're now aware of your issue. So now if you're hearing a lot of 100 hertz and you're aware my room affects 100 hertz, maybe you won't turn it down because you know your room is influencing you. Amplitude, I think amplitude's easy. Basically amplitude relates to loudness. So like I'm going to draw another little sine wave. So if I have this sine wave right here and I draw the same frequency, so it'll start and end at the same spot, the blue wave has a lower amplitude, so therefore it's quieter than the red wave. Even though they're the same frequency, they play the same note, but the blue one is quieter. I don't know if you've ever recorded before, you might have seen like audio waveforms that look like this.
Right.
It seems kind of familiar if you've recorded audio. Just looking at this Y direction is amplitude. So you can be like, oh, that's louder than that. So amplitude, I call it reading the waveforms. You can read the waveforms even before you hit play and kind of get an idea of what's going on in the song. Phase shift, now we're getting crazy. Phase shift can really mess you up and it can really help you. So with phase shift, we're only concerned about phase shift when you have more than one microphone on one source. What I mean by that is like, say I'm a singer, I'm the source, and I have one microphone in front of me. Phase doesn't matter, one microphone, one source, I'm cool. As soon as I put more than one microphone on one source, now I have to start worrying about phase. So now I have two mics in front of the singer. Now I have to start caring about this, and let's talk about why I have to care about it. So I'm going to draw my amazing Picasso here.
Singer. Are you laughing at me? I'm just kidding. Pac-Man singer, all right? I have my microphone.
One source, one mic. I don't care about phase. Let's add another mic and see what happens.
Here's my microphone. Okay.
So now I have to care about phase. So I think the obvious difference between this is like this microphone number 1 is closer to the source than microphone number 2. So if we think about the speed of sound and stuff like that, I think it'd be fair to say that the person's voice is going to hit microphone number 1 before it hits number 2. So let's draw that out as sine waves and kind of look at it. And I'm going to draw the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario doesn't really happen in nature, but it will help us understand what I'm talking about. I'm going to draw my little Cartesian plane. And let's say this microphone the sound hits this microphone at time 0 and sound hits this microphone at time 1. So if time 0 is right here, this first microphone, which I'll draw in red, starts. The singer's singing perfect sine waves. And then number 2 is at time 1, and let's just say time 1 is right here. Okay, we all see what's happening? The singer, this red microphone, the sound hits it first, and then time happens, and then the singer's voice hits microphone number 2. That's where that one starts, okay? So this right here, the red at the bottom and the blue at the top, that's bad. So if we put values on the y-axis, let's just say like the value up here is +1 and the value down here is -1. +1, +1, -1, -1. What is +1 plus -1? 0. So that means this actually cancels out each other and nulls out, complete to 0. You can actually cancel out noise. That's how noise canceling headphones work. They have a microphone on the outside of the headphone and they flip the phase and then it cancels out the noise going into your ears. If you put a song into your recording program and you have your song and then you duplicate it to another track and you flip the phase or flip the polarity of that second track and you hit play, you'll actually hear nothing because those two things are combining and adding to 0 and nothing. You can actually cancel stuff out. Flipping phase, when I'm saying flipping the polarity, we have these, on audio consoles, we have these tools called polarity buttons that kind of look, there's a circle and a dash going through it. And when you press the button, it flips the waveform over the x-axis. So if I have this button on the second microphone and I press it on the second microphone, this blue wave is going to flip over the x-axis and let's see what happens. It flips, and now it's like that. That's good. Because what's -1 plus -1? -2. So we're actually increasing the amplitude. We're actually making the sound louder by having our microphones in phase with each other. How do we fix phase? So this is one method we can fix phase issues with, is with this button. In our recording studio, we have buttons on every microphone channel of a polarity flip. The other thing you can do that changes the phase relationship is just moving the mic. Because if you move the mic, you're moving this wave along the time axis. Let's say like I took number 2 and I moved it closer to number 1. So if I move this blue microphone over a little bit, originally it was starting right here, but since I moved it over, maybe it's going to start right here now. So there's not much cancellation happening anymore. There's still some, but they're mostly in phase, and so that's okay. I didn't explain this when I first started teaching the class, and a lot of people were like, everything has to be perfectly in phase. Not necessarily. You don't want it completely out of phase. So like I said, the thing in nature, like the worst case scenario doesn't happen in nature too often, but the thing that does happen is you lose low end. When things are out of phase from each other, they lose fullness. They lose low end, they sound thin. So like when I'm in the event center doing a concert, kick drums on drum sets, like I want bass coming out of that. I want low end. It's like what hits you in the chest during the concert. I don't want it to sound wimpy. And a lot of times kick drums, I mic with 2 mics. I do an inside mic and I do an outside mic. So I have to care about the phase relationship between those 2 mics, because if they're canceling each other out, then I'm not gonna get any low end from my kick drum, which is the main purpose of the kick drum. So maybe I throw up the mics and they're out of polarity from each other. I can click that polarity button and suddenly they're in polarity with each other and I'm getting the low end that I want. So if you're in the recording studio and maybe you're recording bass guitar or something and you're using 2 microphones on your bass guitar and you go in and you listen to your bass guitar and you're like, wow, it sounds really thin and crappy. Maybe you have a phase issue. Maybe you either need to move the microphones or press that polarity switch. Like phase relationships, like of course you need to make sure you're getting the bass that you want, but maybe that phase relationship is creating some kind of depth in your recording. So maybe I have a mic right here and then I'm singing, I have it right in front of me and then I have one over there. Obviously in time, my voice is hitting this microphone before it's hitting that microphone. But maybe I want that effect. Maybe that's creating some kind of depth in my recording. Reverb. But reverb is like a depth, right? Fletcher Munson. Looks complicated, it is, but we're just going to talk about the core concept of it. Fletcher Munson, they were 2 scientists who studied like human perception and stuff like that, and they kind of discovered that us humans perceive we perceive sounds differently at different volumes, which is interesting and valuable for audio engineers. So that means like I could play the same thing, I could play a song really quiet, then I could play the exact same song really loud, and I would perceive them differently. But let's talk about what the difference is. So remember when I was drawing our human hearing range, I had the lows, the mids, and the highs? When we listen to things at a low volume, we perceive more of that mid-range. When we listen to things at high levels, we actually perceive more lows and more high-end. Where our human hearing is actually most even across our frequencies is when we listen to music at 85 decibels. And decibels measure the intensity of a loudness. When I was talking about amplitude, we could measure the y direction in decibels if we wanted to. So 85 decibels is right around here. So I have a decibel meter on my phone, and so whenever I sit down and I'm mixing something, I turn up my volume until my phone or my decibel meter is telling me 85 decibels. And I know then that that's where my ears are the most neutral. People hire audio engineers for consistency. They want their songs on their album to sound consistent from song to song. They want their songs to sound consistent. So I better be listening to stuff consistently, right? And this 85 decibel thing, like every time I mix, I put my speakers to 85 decibels. But that doesn't mean I'm not listening to my songs loud and quiet. The majority of my mixing is at 85 decibels. Of course, I'll crank it and make sure it sounds good loud. But majority of my mixing, I'm doing at 85 decibels. So all these things are actually affecting the way we're perceiving sound. So it's good to know what is affecting our hearing so we can combat it. We want to mix in the most neutral area. Decibels. So the interesting thing about decibels is that they're a relative unit. They're not an absolute unit. And that's what makes them confusing, I think. So like an absolute unit is like if I have a ruler and you have a ruler, they should be the same. They should be the same. Decibels are relative. They change depending on the situation you're in. Okay, but we have some things that help us. So most times you see this abbreviation for decibels, dB. Remember, decibels are basically loudness, intensity of sound. When you say dB, it doesn't really mean anything because you don't have any context to what you're talking about. Do you see up here it says dBA? The A stands for acoustics. So I know that these values of decibels are relating to an acoustic environment. So that last letter is kind of important because it really tells you which context you're talking about decibels in. When we were talking about at the beginning what sound is a pressure wave that goes through a medium. We already have a way to measure pressure. It's called pascals. You can measure water pressure in pascals. You can measure air pressure in pascals. So why the heck do we have decibels if we already have a measurement of pressure? Because our ears are super sensitive. If we were measuring the way that our ears heard pressure in pascals, our ears are sensitive enough to hear from 20 pascals to 20 trillion pascals. I can't even fathom a trillion. I like this. 0 to 140 is my tiny brain can do that. How do we get this pascal to decibels? We actually put these pascals through a logarithm. And through a logarithm, we were able to derive these numbers. What is a logarithm? I'm going to kind of go over that real quick. For those nerds out there, and we'll talk about, hopefully you'll understand this, we're taking a logarithmic function and turning it into a linear function. Linear functions are easier to understand. I'm going to write a base of 10 because 10 is an easy number. And do some exponent, logarithm stuff. So 10 to the 1 is 10, 10 to the 2 is 100, 10 to the 3 is 1,000, 10 to the 4 is 10,000, and 10 to the 5 is 100,000. We could compare this side of the equation to the Pascal side, from 20 to 20 trillion. 10 to 100,000 is still a huge number range that I don't like. Look at the exponents. You just have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's actually what all those numbers are. These decibels are actually exponents of a more complicated base. I use 10 because 10 is an easy number. So, but the interesting thing is 100 minus 10 is 90, 1,000 minus 100 is 900, 10,000 minus 1,000 is 9,000, and this last one is 90,000. 2 minus 1 is 1, 3 minus 2 is 1, 4 minus 3 is 1, 5 minus 4 is 1. So if we look over here, the difference between 2 and 1 is 1, fair, but on this side of the equation is 90. Let's look at down here, the difference between 5 and 4 is still only 1, but on this side of the equation it's 90,000. It's exponential. So that means pressure is actually, the way we perceive the pressure is exponentially, but we actually hear more linearly. So we hear more like decibels, but the pressure is actually going up exponentially. But basically, I just want you guys to know that from 70 to 75 is not the same from 80 to 85. 80 to 85 is actually, there's greater power between those two values than from 70 to 75 because of this concept. That's a brief explanation of how decibels work and why they function the way they do. I appreciate decibels because it gives us values like 1 to 140 and not from 20 to 20 trillion. Levels. There are three main types of levels that we're concerned about, and all of them have to do with amplitude. So mic levels are what mic levels output, instrument levels are the type of level that instruments output, and line level is basically where we want everything to be. When you listen to music on your iPhone or your Android or whatever you use, when you plug headphones into it, your device is outputting line level audio. Microphone is outputting mic level audio. So if mic level audio is really low, so it might be like a small amplitude like that. Instrument level is a little bigger, and then line level is the biggest level of amplitude. And we want everything to have big amplitude because it makes our devices understand it better. So like I said, like amplitude kind of has to do with loudness. So this like mic level signal is really quiet. This instrument level is a little louder, but still not line level, and line level is the loudness. So like if I'm talking like this is the mic level. You guys are probably hard to understand what I'm saying. But now if I'm line level, you can hear what I'm saying. It's like what our computer needs to understand. Our computer needs line level to understand the audio because it might be too quiet for it to understand. Our amplifiers that we use to amplify our sound need line level signals so they know what the signals are. We have microphones at instrument level. How do we get it up to line level? We have these devices called preamplifiers, okay? And a preamplifier increases the amplitude of levels. We have 16 really high-grade preamplifiers in our recording studio. So that means we can plug in 16 mics into each preamplifier, turn it up to line level, and then record it. If we recorded mic level signals, you probably wouldn't be able to hear it, and there'd be a crap ton of noise. We want everything to be line level. And the way we do that is with preamplifiers. That's the main thing that I want you guys to understand. So what's like the difference between analog audio and digital audio? There's a big to-do about it. If I put my vinyl down on my vinyl player and put my needle on and my vinyl's playing, vinyls have continuous waveforms. Analog audio is continuous, okay? So what I mean by continuous, if like I put my needle down and I hit play, my song is playing, cool, it's still playing, and now my vinyl stops and the waveform ends. What you learn in geometry, I guess, is like what a line is. A line is 2 points with infinite points between those 2 points. Same thing here. Between this point and this point, there's infinity points along this line. Infinite, okay, according to physics. Computers don't understand infinity. You can't tell a computer what infinity is. It's like video cameras, it's like frame rate. When you're taking a video, you're not taking a continuous shot of infinite pictures. You're taking like 30 frames per second. You're taking like 30 pictures per second because a camera can't do infinity. So computers are kind of like in the same conundrum. So computers will sample stuff. Okay, so a computer will look at this waveform and make it discrete. It'll be like, okay, I don't know what infinity is, but I can do this. Now there's a finite amount of dots. Computer likes that. Computer doesn't know what infinity is, but maybe I have 1,000 dots per second. Computer knows what 1,000 dots per second is. It doesn't know what infinity dots per second is. So this is our sample rate. How many samples are happening per second? Kind of like frame rate. With audio, the most common sample rate we have is 44,100 samples per second. And there was this guy named Nyquist who was like a scientist, and he's an entropy scientist actually. And he figured out a lot of this stuff. The main thing he figured out that's really important is, according to the Nyquist theorem, whatever your sample rate is, if you divide that number in half, that number that you're left with is going to be the highest frequency in your digital recording. What is this number divided in half? 22,050? It's right at the upper echelon of what humans can hear. Remember our human hearing range was from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz? It's pretty damn close to the top end of our hearing. So it kind of makes sense that our sample rate is 44,000. That's actually 44,100 samples per second is actually the lowest sample rate you can use on in our studio. Our studio is actually configured, everything in there is configured for actually 48,000 samples per second. 48K. I think that the higher frequencies that we cannot hear actually interact with the lower frequencies we can hear and change it somehow. That's kind of my thought process of why would you capture all that stuff above the human hearing range? Because I actually think that those higher frequencies interact with the lower frequencies and somehow alter it. Another reason why you'd want to record with a super high sample rate is to capture all that high information is like if you slow something down. So if you record something at 44.1 and you slow it down in half, you're effectively making your sample rate 22,050. That's your new sample rate if you slow it down in half. And now if you use the Nyquist theorem on that, your highest frequency in your recording is like 11,000 hertz, which is a lot lower than the human hearing range. So you're actually missing out on a bunch of high-end information. So if you recorded a large sample rate, you are retaining high-end information, which some people want. AD stands for analog to digital. So that's what we're doing. This is what this sample rate is doing. We're taking an analog waveform and we're turning it into a digital waveform. You'll see a lot of times A to D, D to A, and that means analog to digital. So it's recording to our computer, and then to play it back of our computer, we have to turn our digital waveform back into an analog waveform to play it out of speakers. So A to D conversion, D to A conversion. We have some really nice analog to digital converters and digital to analog converters in the recording studio. Our unit has the preamps built into it, and it has the A to D conversion built into it. And honestly, most audio products nowadays are like that anyway. So again, this has to do with time, sample rate, samples per second. It's our x-axis that when I've been drawing the sine waves, time. What about y, the y direction with digital audio? Bit depth. Bit depth affects our y direction in digital audio. So let's draw this Cartesian plane again. I'll draw my digital waveform now because we're in digital land. Okay, so our x-axis is time, and our y-axis is amplitude. And bit depth affects our y-axis. So bit depth relates to SNR, which means signal to noise ratio, which I'll talk about in a second, and the dynamic range of what we're able to record. Signal to noise ratio is basically where our noise is, all analog. Have you guys ever put a cassette tape on and heard hiss? Like the tape hiss? That's noise. That's analog noise. So the signal to noise ratio would be like where, if we were to get a meter, we'd see how far up that noise is, and then we'd play our song, and then maybe our song volume is all the way up here. What is the ratio between the noise and the top of the song? Okay, signal to noise. All analog gear has noise to it, everything. Computers also have noise. It's kind of confusing. So let's talk about how computers have noise. We have different bit depths we can choose from in our audio program. We have 16-bit, we have 24-bit, and we have 32-bit. So, like sample rate, bit depth is a parameter that we choose at the beginning of our session, and then once our session is set to the correct sample rate that we want and the correct bit depth that we want, we can't change it again, unless we create a new session. Then we can change it. Let's say right now my parameter is set to 16-bit. So that means there's 16 lines going in the y direction, positive y, and there's 16 bits going in the negative y direction. These samples that I drew along the audio waveform, they have to land right on a bit. They want to be on a bit. If they land in between a bit, they get rounded to the nearest bit. Okay, and that rounding is called quantization error. This sample moving to the nearest bit is what creates noise in digital. And so if you increase your bit depth from 16 to 32, suddenly you add twice as many notches. And the thing that happens is now your sample has a lot more chance of landing right on a bit, and if it doesn't, it moves less to the nearest bit, therefore less noise. So using a higher bit depth, there will be less noise in your recording than using a lower bit depth. But that doesn't mean that 16-bit is bad. It means it has a little more noise than 32-bit, but I use 16-bit I used it this morning when I did an interview. It's not like there was a ton of noise in my recording or anything like that. So already the lowest setting in our computer has less noise than vinyl and tape, which is cool. 16-bit is, when you listen to Spotify, your Spotify is streaming at 16-bit. So 16-bit isn't bad. The other thing that your bit depth affects is your dynamic range. So I think 16-bit, you have about 96 decibels of dynamic range. 24, you have 144 decibels of dynamic range. 32, you have 192 dB of dynamic range. By dynamic range, I mean the quietest sound to the loudest sound. Opera, classical, jazz, a lot of these type of music are very, very dynamic. I would say, in the orchestra example, maybe when the violins are going and then they all play together and it gets all loud, maybe that difference in decibels might be 50 decibels, which is a lot. But already at 16-bit, we have 96 decibels of dynamic range. So already at the lowest setting in your computer, you can record one of the most dynamic forms of music, which is cool, right? When I'm in the studio, I tend to use 24-bit. I get a lot more dynamic range of recording for 144 decibels. And that just gives me, I just feel safer that way because I have more dynamic range. If you go above the threshold, you get distortion. So I like having a lot. so I don't distort. But of course, like the sample rate, if you use a higher bit depth, you're using more drive space on your computer. So yeah, my settings in the audio studio, the default settings are 48K for sample rate and 24-bit for bit depth. So we have had sample rate, which is our value of time, how many samples happen per second, and our sample rate affects the highest frequency we can record. And now we have bit depth, which is a function of amplitude, and it configures our settings for signal to noise ratio, how much noise we're getting in our recording, and the dynamic range that we're able to record. So if you have somebody who's really dynamic, maybe, but remember, this is a setting you can't change. So if you know you're going to record something extremely dynamic, maybe use a higher bit depth to protect yourself. If you're recording a rock band, rock is just like loud the whole time. It's like not much dynamic to rock. That was a very blanketed statement. Latency. Latency is terrible, sucks. Have you all ever put like headphones on and spoken to a mic and like you heard the delay into your headphones? It's terrible. Yeah, you can hear it back. It's like so I call it drunk goggles for your ears. It's like you can't even talk. And so if you have like talent in your studio, like a singer or something, and they're getting delay in their headphones, they're probably not going to want to work with you again. If the whole time they're trying to sing, they're hearing themselves a half a second later in their headphones. That would suck. And so this process that we've been talking about, sample rate and stuff, like that takes an amount of time. Like our computer, it takes time to do that. And these timing things build up and eventually create enough latency for us to notice and be annoying. And we have buffer size to actually help us fix our latency. So I'm going to draw a little flow chart of like recording. So we have our microphone. What's the first thing we plug our microphone into? Preamp. Gives you more amplitude. Preamp. Takes us our mic from mic level to line level, so now we can record it. From our preamplifier, we hit our first A to D converter. So now our wave is being sampled. Now, usually our A to D converter is plugged into our computer with like a Thunderbolt cable or a USB cable, I don't know, Firewire if you're stuck in 2008. And the first thing that this digital audio hits in your computer is this buffer. After the buffer is our CPU. And our CPU is like what our computer brain is. It's where all the processing where it happens. If you add effects, if you add like echo, or if you add reverb, or you add compression or equalization to your sound, that process is happening in the CPU. Your computer has to think about it and like make it happen. After the CPU, after it does all the processing and whatever, it hits a D to A converter, because now we need to play it out of speakers. It needs to turn back into an analog waveform. So after the A to D converter, you can either have like a pair of headphones, I guess, or you can have some speakers. So it's kind of like a lot of steps that are happening just from microphone to headphones. And all these little things, besides the analog stuff, all the digital stuff takes time to happen, and that's where latency happens. Really, this buffer. So our computers, like our personal computers, they're doing a lot of crap that we don't really like take for granted, or we do take for granted. Audio is like video is kind of hard on your computer. It's making it work. If you had a constant stream of audio samples going into your CPU constantly, your CPU would probably freak out and get really hot, and you'd get an overload error, and your software might crash. This buffer kind of is buffering our CPU from a bombardment of samples, and we can actually change our buffer size. So the lowest buffer we have is like 32-bit, 64-bit is the next one, and all these numbers are coming up from 2 to the power of n, 64-bit, 128-bit, 256-bit, 512, I'm not going to write bit anymore, 1024, 2048. I've seen 4,000-bit buffer sizes before, but I'm not going to write that. So now I'm going to use an analogy to water and buckets to make this help us understand this. So if our 32-bit buffer is like a really small bucket, and then our 2048 buffer is like a huge bucket. So let's first use this example. And the buffer size you can change whenever you want, unlike bit depth and sample rate. You can change the buffer size setting whenever you want when you're in your session. So let's use this big buffer for a second. Let's put this 2048 buffer in place for our buffer size. And let's say this bucket takes 1 second to fill up. This bucket's filling up with samples or water or whatever the analogy we're talking about, and it takes a second to fill up, and during the second it's filling up with water, our CPU is like doing all the background stuff it needs to do. It's checking the time, it's checking the weather, it's checking our email, it's doing all the background stuff. And then when that bucket gets full, the bucket of water gets poured on the CPU gets to process all that stuff, and then it sends it out the A to D or D to A converter to your speakers. And then the bucket goes back to filling up, and then once it's full, it dumps again, and so on. So let's put a tiny buffer size in there now, say 32. Let's say that bucket only takes 1 millisecond to fill up, which is really fast. So every millisecond it fills up and dumps on the CPU, and it's just constantly boom, 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 and eventually your CPU is like, oh my God, and then it crashes and like gets hurt. Our computer's powerful enough to work at 32-bit, it's fine. But maybe your computer at your house isn't. So if you're using like an audio program and you're having a lot of crashes in your audio program, it might be because your buffer size is too low for your computer to handle. So maybe try raising your buffer size a little bit. But with a lower buffer size, it takes a shorter amount of time for that bucket to fill up, so that's the latency. So if you have a small bucket, it's not taking very much time to fill up, so your latency is really quick. It might only be a millisecond of latency. But with a big bucket, you might get a whole second of latency. So my golden rule is when you're tracking with people in the studio who need to hear themselves back in real time, use the lowest buffer size your computer can handle, because you're going to get the least amount of latency. But then when it comes to mix, and you're actually using software for like reverbs and plugins, and you need that kind of processing power, you're not hearing anything. I'm not like playing guitar and have to hear it in real time out of the speakers. I'm just mixing with stuff in the computer already. So I don't really care about latency. I don't care when I really hear it. So I'm going to set my buffer size to the highest it can be so I get the most out of my computer in terms of processing power. So when I'm mixing, I use a high buffer size. When I'm tracking, I use a low buffer size. We got our sample rate, we got our bit depth, and we have our buffer size. Those are the three main aspects that are going to impact you in the recording studio. So now let's talk about some mics. This is the part of class where everyone starts getting really tired, and I understand because it's been a crap ton of information. But this is also like one of my favorite parts of class because I'm a huge nerd and like microphones a lot. Anyway, so microphones are transducers, okay? What is a transducer? A transducer takes one form of energy and turns it into another form of energy. So with microphones, we're taking sound pressure, like when I'm speaking, like we've been learning about, sound is just a pressure wave. Microphones take this pressure wave and convert it into electricity, and then send that electricity down a wire. That's what a transducer is doing. Speakers are backwards from that. A speaker takes a voltage down a wire, and then moves a cone back and forth and creates air pressure, and we're taking electricity and turning it into air pressure. Speakers and microphones are literally the exact same thing, but backwards. I've taken a microphone, I've plugged it into a headphone output, and I've listened to music coming out of a microphone. I've taken a speaker, and I've put it in front of a drum set, and I wired it backwards, and I've recorded a drum set through a speaker. They're both transducers, we're just using them in opposite directions. The three types of microphones that we have in the recording studio are dynamic, ribbon, and condenser, and we're going to talk about each one. Dynamic mics are really cool. They're the most robust mics for sure. They're the most common mics out there. I'm sure everyone's seen like an SM58 or a black handle and then a silver grill on top that's like a circle. You see singers use them all the time at live music venues. Those are dynamic mics. Dynamic mics are, like I said, are the most robust, so that's why you see a lot of live musicians and live sound engineers using dynamic mics because they don't break that easily. Michael Jackson recorded all of his vocals through a dynamic mic. They're kind of workhorse microphones. I use them to record guitars, I use them to record basses, drums, horns, whatever. So how the heck do they work? Dynamic mics, they have a diaphragm. This diaphragm is usually made out of mylar. If you were to look straight at the diaphragm, it'd be a circle, but in this example, I'm looking at it sideways, so I'm gonna draw it kind of as an oval like that. This diaphragm is connected to a voice coil, and the voice coil is like a copper spring that is receded back into the housing of the microphone. Within the housing of the microphone, there is a magnet that is floating inside the coil of the voice coil. So it's kind of like that. It's not touching the coil anywhere, but it's just kind of floating there. There's this amazing relationship between magnets and metal. It's called magnetic flux. First of all, magnets have a magnetic field going around them constantly. Like we kind of learn in physics in high school or whatever. If I take a piece of metal and I move around, if I move it around the magnet, I'm going to alter the magnetic field around the magnet. When you do that, you induce a voltage, which is kind of magic. Like in the Hoover Dam, for instance, the water is moving a turbine, the turbine's spinning, it's moving a piece of metal around a magnet and sending voltage down a wire and powering Las Vegas. Same kind of concept. With this diaphragm is going to be hit with air pressure, and this diaphragm is going to move back and forth from the air pressure. That back and forth movement is translating to this spring or whatever, this voice coil, and I'm moving a piece of metal around a magnet, and I'm inducing a voltage down a wire. This voltage is almost perfectly analogous to the pressure wave that hit the diaphragm. So when I was talking about sampling of the sample rate, when your computer is sampling the sample rate, it's not sampling air pressure, it's sampling a voltage down a wire. So yeah, that's what microphones do. They turn pressure into electricity, and that electricity perfectly represents the air pressure that hit the diaphragm. That process of turning air pressure into electricity via a piece of metal and a magnet is called electromagnetic induction. Ribbon mics were the first microphones that were ever made, actually. They're also the most fragile. We have 2 of them, don't break them. I'll tell you how to break them so you don't. So ribbon microphones, there's this U magnet that we're all pretty, horseshoe magnet that we're probably all familiar with. And in between the 2 poles of the magnet lies this diaphragm. This diaphragm is the ribbon, and the diaphragm in ribbon mics is made out of aluminum, so it is a metal. This aluminum is really, really thin. It's about 30 nanometers thick. It's really thin. That's why they're so fragile. But, you know, when you talk into this microphone, this diaphragm moves back and forth between the magnet, and you're moving a piece of metal around a magnet, and you're inducing a voltage down a wire. Same way that the dynamic mic worked. Except the dynamic mic had a mylar diaphragm connected to a metal spring, but the diaphragm in this case is the piece of metal. Since that metal strip is so thin, I mean, just if this is the microphone, and I just into it, I could break that ribbon. They're extremely sensitive to air pressure. Another thing that I'm going to talk about the next slide, there's some microphones that need power in order to operate, and that power is called phantom power. If you send phantom power to a ribbon, that ribbon is like a fuse, and if you send too much electricity through a fuse, it pops. It explodes. So if you send phantom power to ribbons, they explode. Someone asked me, it's not like if I'm standing in front of it and it explodes, it's not going to like explode in my face or anything. No. It's like a light bulb, filament light bulb. It's just, you might hear a pop. It's not going to blow up in your face or anything like that. But don't do that. Don't send phantom power to our ribbons, because then you have to buy them too. It's going to suck. Qualities of ribbon mics. Why would you use ribbon mics if they're like so sensitive and like stuff like that? They're considered dark. They don't have much high end to them. They also have a little low end boost, which is nice on some sources. I love using ribbon mics on things that sound harsh to my ears because they're lacking that high end stuff. They kind of tames out harshness. So with like drummers, I find drum cymbals really harsh to my ear. And so I like using ribbon mics on harsh cymbals because the quality of the ribbon kind of tames out all the harshness of the cymbal. And I appreciate that. I didn't have to do any processing on the computer, just the microphone made it sound better to me. To hint on that, I think there's like 4 rules in recording that make a great recording. First of all, have a good player. That's kind of obvious. If you have a crappy player, your recording is going to sound like crap. Maybe have a good instrument too. Good player and a good instrument. And then after that, a good mic. And when I say good mic, I don't mean like expensive mic. I mean good mic for the source, like ribbon mic or dynamic mic or condenser mic. And then the last thing is mic placement. If this marker is my instrument and this is the front of my microphone, if I face it that way, it's probably going to sound a lot worse than if I face it that way. So placement of the microphone, the type of microphone, and the player and instrument. If you can nail those 4 things down, you're going to have a great recording. That's the secret sauce. It's not about the processing in the computer. It's not about your plugins and like whatever. I truly think if you have a good player and a good instrument and a good microphone and correct placement, you don't have to do much in the computer to make your recording sound good. If you can nail those 4 things, thumbs up. Condenser mics are the microphones that need phantom power to work. They need the power. They need the power. The diaphragm in a condenser mic has a back plate that's fixed that never moves, and then there's a front plate that does move, and then in between the front plate and back plate there's this stuff called dielectric material. What I'm drawing right here is actually a capacitor. You'll hear British people call these mics capacitor mics, which I think is funny. But anyway, so it's kind of the same thing as the other mics. This mic doesn't use magnets and metal in order to induce a voltage. It does something else. This dielectric material needs to get charged. That's why we send power to it to charge this material. And there's this little equation in physics called Q equals V times C. Charge equals voltage times capacitance. It is a capacitor. So when you sing into this front mic, or this front plate is going to move back and forth and change the charge of the dielectric material. And if you change the charge of the dielectric material, you're affecting voltage and you're inducing a voltage down a wire. This is the same kind of thing. The main part of microphones is inducing voltages down wires. It's a lot more complicated than that. That was very brief. But anyway, condenser mics, they're probably the most sensitive mics. They pick up everything. They are very intimate. I've had a condenser mic in my bedroom and I've heard the fridge on the other side of the house in my headphones. They pick up everything. The first time I listened to Billie Eilish, I like her music a lot. I think her vocals sound amazing. First time I listened to her, I felt like her vocals were like right in my ears. Like she was right there, and I could hear the spit in between her lips. I could hear all the intimacy of the vocal, and I was like, she used a condenser mic for sure. I could hear all the intricacies. They're considered bright mics. So if you have like a drum cymbal that's really bright, maybe don't use a condenser mic on that, so it'll be even brighter. If you're trying to pick up a lot of detail on something, like if you're recording opera, maybe you'll want to use a condenser mic because opera is very intimate and you want to hear all the details. If you're recording a solo instrument, maybe like cello or harp or something like that. You might want to use a condenser mic to get all the intimacy out of it. Sometimes podcasters will ask me what kind of mic they should get for their podcast studio. And I ask them, are you in a crappy room or are you in a good room? If you're in a crappy room, if you use a condenser mic, your condenser mic is going to pick up the crappiness of your room, and your recording is going to sound like you're recorded in a crappy room. If you use a dynamic mics pick up a lot less of around them. Dynamic mic isn't going to pick up the room as much. So if they're in a crappy room, I would say maybe use a dynamic mic. If they're in a great room and they have acoustic treatment and all that kind of stuff, maybe use a condenser mic. A lot of singers, their first go-to are condenser mics. A lot of singers and like voice actors and stuff like condenser mics. And this process of changing the charge of your diaphragm to induce a voltage is called the electrostatic principle. So it's different than the electromagnetic induction. But anyway, any questions on condensers? Are we feeling okay? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So phantom power is just 48 volts DC, being sent down your mic cable to power your microphone. 48 volt DC. So that's just the voltage that goes down your mic cable to power your condenser microphone. And that's the same kind of power that will blow up your ribbon. So don't send phantom power to your microphone. On every microphone channel, we have that polarity switch that I was talking about, and we have a phantom power button on every single channel of our microphone preamps. So on every single mic preamp, we have a phantom power button and we have a polarity button. So you have the potential to blow up ribbons. So don't. Well, the thing is, like, everyone's scared of it, but it's really obvious when phantom power's on because there's a big red LED. All you have to do is look at it and be like, oh yeah, it's on. I'm gonna turn it off. Cable types. This is another one of my favorite parts of class. There's basically two types of cables that we're concerned about. There's unbalanced cables and then there are balanced cables. There's a crap ton of different connectors. We're all familiar with like VGA connectors that you used to plug into your VCR, the red, yellow, white, or like 1/4 inch, like guitar cables or like microphone. There are all these different connectors, but there's basically two types of cables. There's balanced versus unbalanced. The first type of cable, and the most simple cable, is an unbalanced cable. Us musicians kind of recognize what this is. This is a guitar cable. And you see this black line right here? This black line is actually dividing the connector into two separate areas. It's dividing it between the tip and the sleeve. So our tip is also called our hot, if you're an electrical engineer, I guess, and our sleeve is also known as ground. So here's our one wire, and here's another wire. Down the sleeve of our mic cable, there are two wires, and one wire is soldered to the tip on the inside of this connector, and the other wire is soldered to the sleeve of the inside of the connector. The tip of the cables is actually what carries our signal. So like if I'm recording guitar, here's my guitar signal. Woo, yay. Our ground is complicated in electrical engineering. Just know that it helps with noise. Specifically AC ground noise. Very simple design, kind of makes sense. We just have one wire that carries the signal and another wire that's helping out with noise. The thing about these cables is they are very susceptible to RF interference. What is RF? RF is radio frequency. Across the street we have the NPR affiliated radio station. What is it called? QAF. There are antennas on top of our building over here. So if our studio is wired with unbalanced cables, we'd probably get a crap ton of radio in our recording studio, which would be bad. You don't want that. I've had a guitar cable plugged into my amp before, and I've heard like Christian AM radio coming through my amp. I don't want that coming out of my amp. I want my guitar to come out of my amp. Basically, unbalanced cables are antennas. If you have a really long antenna, you're gonna pick up more stuff. That's why you don't really see many guitar cables that are like 100 feet long. Most guitar cables are like 10 to 20 feet long because they're unbalanced and they're susceptible to RF interference. So how do we protect ourselves from RF interference? Boom, balanced cables, y'all. So this connector is very similar to this one, except on this one we have two lines. This one, we have one line. So because there's two lines on this one, we're dividing our connector into three different spots. We have our tip, ring, and sleeve. So we still have our tip and sleeve, but now we add this new thing called our ring, or cold. So now we have three wires instead of two running down the sleeve of our cable. That third ring makes a big difference. So what does it do? So our tip is still carrying our guitar signal or our vocal signal or whatever. I'll explain what the ring does in a second, and the ground is still doing the same thing. What the ring is doing is sending the exact same signal as the tip, except it's out of polarity. And you might be like, wait, Nick, when we were learning about phase, you said when things are out of polarity, they sum to zero. You're right. you're right. But there's some cleverness going on. So let's chill on that. We know that we have two signals going down our tip and our ring, and they're both the same signal, except they're completely out of polarity from each other. If I have these 3 wires going down the sleeve of my cable, I think it'd be fair to say when RF hits these cables, it's hitting them all the same, because they're all right next to each other in the sleeve of the cable. It's hitting them all at the same time, so the radio frequency is in phase between all 3 cables. So this green marker will be my Christian AM radio. And so those 2 green signals are in phase with each other. The blue signals are out of phase from each other, or out of polarity. So the secret is right here. There's a little component at the end of this wire that flips the polarity of all the signals on that wire. So now what happens is that the blue signal, everything gets mirrored. So now the blue signal is in phase with the blue signal. And now the green signal, since it was in phase before, now it's out of phase with the green signal. And when those 2 signals combine, the green signals sum to 0, but the blue signals combined to our original signal. So actually using phase and polarity, we're able to remove RF from a balanced cable, just like that. It's pretty awesome. I think whoever made that was really clever. Really clever. Such a simple fix. Using the idea of phase. Originally the blues are out of phase from each other and the greens are in phase. And now over here, once we flip the phase of this cable, now the blues are in phase and the greens are out of phase. And now the greens are summing to 0, removing the Christian AM radio from our cable, which is good. I don't want that coming out of my microphone. We okay with that? All the cables in our recording studio are balanced. Besides, we have some guitar cables in there that are unbalanced. Somebody asked me one time, why do we still use unbalanced cables then? It's a good question. I think it has to do with cost. They're just way cheaper to make. And guitar players, if they want a 100-foot cable, they're usually using wireless anyway. Lossless versus lossy. This stuff's cool. It's basically WAV versus MP3. We have lossless audio files, which are the type of files that we are actually recording, like into GarageBand or Audacity or Pro Tools or whatever. Full quality files. It's like when you take pictures with your camera, you have a raw picture, and then you can turn it into a JPEG. So lossless, the main lossless file that we use is .wav. Apple has a version of the .wav called the .aiff. They just wanted to be different, make their own thing, but it's basically the same thing. It's just Apple being Apple. Then we have lossy, and the lossy file type that everyone's familiar with is .mp3. The other type of lossy file that Apple also made is .aac, basically same thing. A 3-minute song that's a WAV file might be 100 megabytes. If you were to convert that to an MP3, it'd be about 10 megabytes. It's bonkers to me that they were able to figure out that they could remove 90% of the information and retain great quality. Specifically, this MP3, if it's a high quality MP3, the highest quality is 320 kilobits per second. And like when you're streaming Spotify on your phone or you're listening to anything like that, you're usually listening to high quality MP3s. And they're actually pretty difficult to tell the difference between a high quality MP3 and a full quality WAV file. It's not impossible, but it's kind of hard. The only way I could hear the difference was like if I turned the MP3 really loud and I heard it fading out. As it got really quiet, as it was fading out, I heard some digitalization at the end. It sounded a little grainy to me. That's the only difference that I heard. But if I'm sending a song to get it put on a CD or to get it put on Spotify or whatever, I send them the full version of the WAV. If I made a song in my bedroom and I want to send my buddy the song and, hey, check this out, I'll just attach the MP3 to an email and send it to them. 10 megabyte files can be attached to emails fine. I don't need to use Dropbox or like Google Drive or anything like that. I can just attach it to the email and send it off. A lot of programs like Pro Tools and Logic and a bunch of these audio programs give you the option to export WAV and MP3 at the same time. That's what I usually do. I usually have my WAV version of the song and then an MP3 version of the song. Lossless versus lossy, we kind of get that. High quality versus low quality. MP3s, you remove information in order to make them smaller. Lossless files, you're still using some kind of data compression algorithm, but you're literally not taking any information away. With MP3s, you're removing information and making the file smaller. DAW, I might have said this once or twice, and like, what the heck is DAW? DAW stands for Digital Audio Workstation, and basically it's just like, what software do you use to record? Are you using GarageBand? Are you using Audacity? Pro Tools? Are you using Logic, Reason, Ableton, whatever? On the back of the door in the recording studio, I made a QR code, and the QR code takes you to a curated playlist of all the topics I just talked about, of other people on YouTube talking about it. I think I found some pretty good videos, so if I didn't explain something well enough, or like it just wasn't clicking, maybe you can watch that playlist and hopefully maybe someone else who explains it will explain it better than I did and maybe help you understand it better. But anyway, that's it, y'all.